I'm Tyler, 28, and until a few months ago, I thought my family was normal. Not perfect, but functional. My parents had their quirks. Mom was a bit of a control freak. Dad worked too much and avoided conflict, but nothing that screamed toxic. We weren't the kind of family that yelled or slammed doors. No, we specialized in quiet tension. The kind where people smile too much at dinner, and you can feel something ugly hiding behind the mashed potatoes. For most of my life, I kept my head down. I moved out at 22, worked as an IT technician, and thought I'd finally carved out a life that didn't revolve around my parents' moods. But families have a way of pulling you back in, especially when money, guilt, and secrets start to mix. I never imagined how deep that would go, or how fast things could unravel once the truth started peeking through the cracks. It all started about 3 months ago when I came home for what was supposed to be a short visit. My mom had called me on a Tuesday morning with her usual bright but pressured voice. "Tyler, honey, can you come by this weekend? It's been ages." I hesitated because, honestly, I didn't love going back to that house. It wasn't that anything awful happened there. It was just the atmosphere. The air always felt thick, like I was walking into a room where a fight had already happened, and everyone was pretending it hadn't. But she sounded insistent, so I agreed. When I pulled into the driveway that Saturday, I noticed how much the place had changed. The yard was overgrown, the gutters sagged, and the once white paint had turned a pale gray. My dad's old truck was parked in the same spot it had been for years, rust blooming along the doors. The sight of it made something twist in my stomach. I didn't realize it then, but that small detail, the neglected house, was the first clue that something was deeply wrong. Mom greeted me with her usual energy, hugging me like we hadn't seen each other in years. "You've lost weight," she exclaimed, even though I hadn't. "You're eating enough, right?" That was her way of easing into a conversation, half praise, half criticism. I brushed it off and followed her into the house. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the clutter. Piles of unopened mail on the counter, receipts, empty Amazon boxes. The kitchen table was buried under papers, half-eaten food, and a small stack of envelopes marked urgent. Mom noticed me looking and quickly started shuffling things around, pretending to tidy up. "I've been meaning to go through these," she said, a little too fast. "You know how it is. Your father keeps everything." I nodded, though a part of me felt uneasy. Dad had always been meticulous. His idea of chaos was leaving a screwdriver out of place. Seeing bills scattered like that didn't fit him at all. Dad came in a few minutes later, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked older, not just physically tired, but worn out in a way I'd never seen before. "Hey, son," he said quietly, offering a half smile. He'd never been good at expressing emotions, but I could tell something was eating at him. I wanted to ask, but Mom interrupted before I could. "Dinner's almost ready. Tyler, why don't you set the table?" Dinner was awkward. The small talk felt rehearsed, like we were all actors reading from a script. Mom kept bringing up old stories from when I was a kid, laughing too loudly. Dad barely said a word, just kept glancing at her, then at me, like there was something he wanted to say but couldn't. When I left that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. A few days later, I got a call from Mom asking for a tiny favor. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor underneath it. She asked if I could help them go through some financial papers because, according to her, Dad had been a bit behind on things. That was strange. Dad handled all the finances. Always had. So I came back the following weekend, not really knowing what I was walking into. When I arrived, Mom was sitting at the table, surrounded by stacks of bills. Her hair was tied up messily, her eyes red and puffy. "It's just a bit of disorganization," she said quickly when she saw my face. "Your father's been distracted." Distracted. That word stuck with me. I started looking through the papers, trying to make sense of the chaos. Credit card statements, medical bills, late fees. Some were months overdue. My heart sank as I added them up, thousands of dollars, all unpaid. I glanced at Mom, who was now avoiding my eyes. "Mom, what is all this?" She hesitated. "It's nothing you need to worry about." "Nothing," I repeated, my voice rising. "These are final notices." "How long has this been going on?" Before she could answer, Dad walked in. He froze when he saw the table covered in bills. His face went pale. "What's this?" Mom stood up quickly, stepping between us. "Nothing. It's just, Tyler's helping me sort through," but Dad wasn't listening. His eyes locked on the envelopes, then on me. "I can't believe you never told me." he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. I stared at him, confused and frozen. Told you what? He turned to Mom, anger and disbelief written all over his face. You told me you were handling it. You said everything was under control. Mom's lips trembled, and for the first time in my life, I saw real fear in her eyes. She whispered something I couldn't quite hear, then looked at both of us and said, "You have no idea what's coming next." The room went silent. I didn't understand what she meant, but the way she said it sent chills down my spine. My dad stepped back, like he'd just been punched. I looked between them, trying to piece together what was happening, but all I could see were two people on the edge of something breaking. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my old room, staring at the ceiling, listening to their muffled voices through the wall. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was sharp. Accusations, pleas, something shattering beneath the surface. In the morning, Dad was gone. His truck wasn't in the driveway. Mom sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, her hands shaking slightly. When I asked where he went, she said quietly, "He needed time to think." I pressed her for answers, but she just stared out the window. "Tyler," she finally said, "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to think less of me." And that's when I realized this wasn't just about bills or disorganization. There was something bigger underneath it all, something she'd been hiding for a long time. That day was the start of everything. The lies, the confrontations, the unraveling. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find out exactly what Mom meant when she said, "You have no idea what's coming next." And she was right. I didn't. The next week, everything started to fall apart. I didn't even realize it at first, just small things that didn't add up. Dad stopped answering my calls, which wasn't like him. He'd always been quiet, but not absent. And Mom started calling more often than usual, her tone swinging wildly between forced cheerfulness and tearful guilt. I kept telling myself it was just stress, that they were going through a rough patch. But deep down, something told me the problem wasn't new. It had just been uncovered. A few days after that visit, Mom asked if I could come by again. She said she needed help sorting through more papers, but her voice cracked when she said it. I agreed, partly because I was worried and partly because I wanted answers. When I got there, the house looked worse than before. There were new piles of mail, unopened boxes, and a faint smell of something burnt coming from the kitchen. Mom greeted me with a tight smile, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee. "Your father's staying with your Aunt Marla for now," she said, as if announcing a temporary arrangement. "He just needs space." That was the first time my stomach truly dropped. Aunt Marla lived 3 hours away. "Did he say when he's coming back?" I asked carefully. She looked down. "No, but he will. He always does." She tried to sound confident, but the way her voice faltered told me otherwise. I sat across from her and waited, giving her time to talk. For years, that had been our dynamic, her talking, me listening. But this time, there was a desperation behind her words. "Your father doesn't understand what it's like," she said suddenly, her voice sharper now. He never appreciated everything I've done for this family. I held it all together while he focused on his job. And when things got hard, when the bills started piling up, he blamed me. I didn't know what to say. The part about the bills made me tense up again. "Mom, what had happened with the bills? You said it was just a mistake." She laughed bitterly. "A mistake? Oh, if only. Your father made plenty of those. I just tried to fix them." Her words didn't make sense, and when I pressed for more details, she changed the subject. She started talking about family loyalty, about how people abandon each other too easily, about how some people, and I knew she meant Dad, never recognize sacrifice. It wasn't until later that day that I found out what she meant by sacrifice. While she was upstairs taking a shower, I started organizing the papers again. I wasn't snooping, at least not at first. I just wanted to help clean the mess. But as I picked through the envelopes, I noticed several of them weren't addressed to my parents at all. They were in my name. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I opened one. It was a bank statement. For a credit card account I didn't recognize. My name, my address, but an account I had never opened. My pulse spiked as I flipped through the others. There were 5 of them, all in my name, all maxed out. Thousands of dollars in debt. I felt cold all over. When Mom came downstairs, I was still holding the papers. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Her expression flickered. Shock, then something else. "Tyler, let me explain." "Explain what?" "You open credit cards in my name." She put her hands up defensively. It's not what you think. I was going to pay them off. Your father was supposed to handle the mortgage, but he didn't. I had to keep the house afloat. By using my credit? Her voice rose. I had no choice. That sentence echoed in my head like a siren. She said it again, louder this time, tears in her eyes. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to use your name? I was desperate, Tyler. I was trying to protect this family. Protect. That word made me snap. Protect us from what, Mom? From Dad? From the truth. Her face hardened. You wouldn't understand. You've always been your father's son. The way she said it, sharp, cold, hit me harder than I expected. Suddenly, all those moments from childhood made sense. The subtle ways she favored my sister, Ashley. The guilt trips when I didn't visit enough. The constant comparisons to Dad whenever I disagreed with her. It wasn't random. It was a pattern. I grabbed the stack of bills and stormed out, ignoring her calls behind me. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. My mom, had used my name to rack up debt. And Dad didn't know. When I finally called him, he answered on the third ring. His voice was flat. Hey, Tyler. Dad? I said slowly. Did you know Mom opened accounts in my name? There was silence on the other end. Then a sigh. I suspected something. That answer hit harder than I expected. You suspected it? And you didn't tell me? I didn't want to believe it, he said quietly. But after what I found out last week, I guess I should have. What did you find out? He hesitated. She took out a second mortgage without telling me. The house isn't even fully ours anymore. My chest felt tight. So you're saying, what? She's been hiding all this for years. Longer than you think, he said. And it's not just money she's been hiding. Those words chilled me. What do you mean? I'll explain when we talk in person, he said. But, Tyler, stay calm around her. Please, don't let her manipulate you. That word, manipulate, stuck in my head for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, things got worse. Mom started leaving voicemails, long rambling ones about how I'd betrayed her, how everything she did was for the family. Then Ashley, my sister, called me. Tyler, what did you say to Mom? She's been crying nonstop, she said, her tone full of accusation. I found out she opened credit cards in my name, Ashley, I said, my voice tight. Thousands in debt. And apparently, Dad didn't know either. There was a pause. Okay, but she was just trying to help, Ashley said, like it was the most logical thing in the world. She told me Dad left her with nothing. What was she supposed to do? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So you think it's fine to steal from your own son? Don't be dramatic, she said. You make good money. You can handle it. That sentence made something in me snap. The entitlement, the dismissal, the way she brushed off what Mom did. It was the same pattern. Ashley had always been the favorite. The golden one. The one who could do no wrong. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. 2 days later, I came home from work to find a certified letter in my mailbox. My stomach sank when I saw it was from a debt collection agency. I opened it on the spot and felt the air leave my lungs. They were suing me for unpaid debt. One of the cards Mom opened had gone into default. I called her immediately, panic boiling over into anger. She didn't answer. When I drove to the house the next morning, her car was gone. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked stripped down, like she'd been packing. There were boxes labeled photos, documents, and kitchen, but the stack of bills was still on the table, untouched. I called Dad. She's gone, I said. He was silent for a long time. She took something from me too, he said finally. More than you realize. I didn't understand what he meant until he told me to check the safe in their bedroom. I knew the combination. He taught me years ago. When I opened it, I froze. Inside were several manila folders, bank statements, property documents, and an envelope with my name written in Mom's handwriting. I opened it, expecting another apology or excuse. Instead, it was a copy of a legal document, something that made my blood run cold. A transfer of ownership. She'd signed over part of my inheritance, money from my grandmother's estate, to pay off her debts. Without telling me. Without telling anyone. That was the moment everything shattered. The quiet tension that had lingered my whole life suddenly made sense. The favoritism, the guilt, the secrecy, it wasn't just emotional manipulation. It was calculated. I sat there, surrounded by papers and empty boxes, realizing my own mother had stolen from me, lied to my father, and dragged both of us into ruin. And that was before I found out what she had done with Ashley. Because when Dad finally told me the truth about that, everything I thought I knew about my family, about loyalty, about love, collapsed completely. After that day, I didn't know where to start. The betrayal hit me harder than anything I'd ever experienced. My mother, my own mother, had systematically destroyed my financial security, used my name without permission, and apparently lied to my father for years. And Ashley, she'd stood by and made excuses. I felt like the ground beneath me had given way, and I was falling endlessly into a pit I didn't even know existed. For the first few days, I couldn't bring myself to go into work. I sat in my apartment, staring at the walls, going over every conversation, every dinner, every smile from my family, wondering what had been genuine and what had been manipulation. My mind kept returning to that moment when I opened the safe and saw the legal documents. My inheritance, my grandmother's money, gone, or at least partially stolen. It wasn't just money. It was proof that my family didn't see me as their own, not really. The first night, I cried alone, curled up on my couch. I made a silent vow. I wasn't going to let them break me. Not completely, but I had no plan, no guidance, no support. Every step I took seemed weighted, like wading through water with concrete boots. The debt collection letters piled up on my kitchen counter, each one a reminder that I was being dragged into a mess I never asked for. I decided to take stock of what I still had. I sold some of my old electronics and gadgets to cover the most urgent payments. It wasn't much, but it bought me breathing room. At the same time, I quietly started digging into the accounts Mom had opened. I called the banks, explained the situation, and began disputing everything I could. Every phone call felt like pulling teeth, every explanation met with doubt or skepticism, but I kept going. I realized quickly that if I didn't take control of this situation, no one else would. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into projects, stayed late, and tried to compartmentalize my emotions. It wasn't healthy, but it gave me purpose. When I started seeing small successes at work, projects completed ahead of schedule, recognition from my manager, I felt a flicker of pride, something I hadn't felt in a long time. But even as I rebuilt my financial footing, the emotional scars lingered. I avoided calling my parents. I avoided talking to Ashley. I wasn't ready to deal with the manipulation, the excuses, or the gaslighting. Every time I thought about confronting them, a mix of anger and hurt would surge through me. I knew I couldn't react impulsively. They had spent years shaping me into someone who deferred to them, who swallowed anger, who accepted their narrative. I couldn't fall back into that trap. I started documenting everything. Emails, letters, receipts, screenshots of statements, notes about conversations. I created a meticulous record of everything I could. I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but I knew one day it would matter. Then, slowly, things began to shift. I started reaching out to friends I hadn't spoken to in months, even years. People who had always supported me, but had been pushed aside by my focus on family obligations. I told them bits and pieces of what happened, careful not to overwhelm them, but enough that I felt less alone. Their support, sometimes just a text checking in, sometimes a coffee meeting, gave me energy. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I sat down with my laptop and started researching small business opportunities. I'd always had an interest in tech and digital services, but I'd never pursued it seriously. Now, with nothing to lose, I started planning. I didn't have investors, I didn't have funding, and I didn't even have a detailed roadmap, but I had an idea, a small consultancy for IT services tailored to local businesses. I pored over every detail: how to register a business, taxes, marketing strategies, even minor legal issues I might face. My past experiences at work gave me an edge. I knew what clients wanted, how to communicate with them, how to fix problems efficiently. I started taking small steps, creating a website, setting up social media profiles, reaching out to old contacts. Every email I sent, every client I spoke with, felt like reclaiming a piece of my life. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family deteriorated further. Mom began leaving cryptic voicemails again, apologizing and then guilt-tripping me in the same sentence. Ashley called once, trying to convince me that I was overreacting. I didn't respond. Each contact reminded me of the betrayal, of the debts, of the lies. But I refused to let their chaos derail me. One morning, I received a letter from my father. It was brief, handwritten, and unlike his usual formal notes. He didn't apologize for what had happened. nor did he excuse Mom. Instead, he wrote, "Tyler, I've made mistakes, but I see now that you are stronger than I ever realized. Don't let them define you. I'm proud of you, son." Dad, I read it over and over. It was the first genuine acknowledgement of my strength from either parent. No manipulation, no demands, just recognition. That letter gave me a strange sense of validation, as though the past few months had been a test I had survived. I continued building the business quietly. Each contract I landed, each client satisfied, added to my confidence. Slowly, the financial burden of the credit cards became manageable. I was no longer drowning. I was treading water. Then I started swimming. During this time, I also began looking at my personal finances more critically. I created budgets, set aside savings, and even started investing. My life, for the first time in years, felt like something I controlled. My identity wasn't defined by Mom's manipulation or Ashley's entitlement. It was defined by me. But the real turning point came when I began to imagine payback. Not out of spite, not recklessly, but as a means of reclaiming power. I didn't want to just rebuild. I wanted to rise above them. I wanted the world to see what they had done and for them to realize, finally, that their actions had consequences. I started making a quiet list of all the ways they had wronged me. Every lie, every financial manipulation, every insult disguised as a compliment. I took notes on timing, patterns, and witnesses, people who could corroborate my story if needed. My goal wasn't vengeance in the emotional, destructive sense. It was precision, careful, calculated. As I worked on the list, I also found allies in unexpected places. Former neighbors who had witnessed odd behavior, distant relatives who had quietly suffered under Mom's manipulations, even coworkers who had been subtly undermined by her when she tried to involve them in family drama. Each conversation, each detail collected, added a sense of momentum. By the end of the year, I had built something that felt untouchable, a growing business, a restored financial footing, and a meticulous record of my family's betrayals. I was still angry, still hurt, but no longer paralyzed. I was no longer a victim. And then came the moment that would test everything I had built so far. It was a Friday evening, late. I had just finished closing a deal with a new client, and the adrenaline was still pumping through me. I received an unexpected notification, a social media message from Ashley. I almost deleted it, almost ignored it, but curiosity won. "Tyler," it read. "Mom and we need to talk. Can you come by?" I stared at the message for a long time. I could feel the tension knotting in my stomach. I wanted to ignore it completely. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. But a small, stubborn part of me, the part that had grown stronger over these months, wanted to hear what she had to say. Not because I trusted her, but because I needed to understand what they were planning next. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I sat back, thinking. I realized that this might be my first real opportunity, not to react emotionally, but to strategize. I wasn't the scared kid from my childhood anymore. I wasn't the son who swallowed guilt because Mom or Dad said so. I was Tyler, 28, with a growing business, control of my finances, and a meticulously documented record of everything they had done. The message could be a trap. I knew that. And yet, part of me, maybe the part that had been fueled by months of quiet rebuilding, felt a thrill at the thought of facing them. I could finally confront them on my terms. That night, I made a plan. A careful, detailed strategy. I would hear them out, gather any new evidence, and prepare for the confrontation that I had been building toward for months. But I wasn't going to jump in blindly. Every step would be calculated, precise, and deliberate. As I went to bed that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. The chaos my mother and sister had created was still there, yes, but I was no longer at the mercy of it. I had hit rock bottom, yes, but I had quietly climbed out of the pit. And now, for the first time, I could see the next step clearly. Over the next few weeks, I became hyper-focused on preparation. This wasn't going to be emotional, sloppy revenge. I had learned that lesson the hard way. Months of being blindsided by Mom's manipulations and Ashley's entitlement had taught me the value of patience, precision, and leverage. I needed to assemble the facts, solidify my footing, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. The first step was fortifying my finances. I worked tirelessly, taking on additional contracts, negotiating higher rates, and building up a reserve that would cover any emergency. Each payment to the fraudulent credit cards felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of my dignity. By the time I finished, I was debt-free. That was satisfying, but it was just the beginning. Next, I focused on documentation. Every email from Mom, every call from Ashley, every financial statement, every bank document was meticulously filed and backed up. I created a digital folder labeled Evidence, with subfolders for finance, communication, property, and personal manipulation. I even kept screenshots of social media interactions and text messages where they tried to gaslight me or distort events. I realized that if I wanted this to have real impact, I needed irrefutable proof. I also started quietly reaching out to people who could support me if things escalated. A distant cousin on my father's side had always been sympathetic to my perspective. She had quietly suffered through Mom's favoritism and manipulations herself. I sent her a careful message, explaining the situation without too much detail, and she responded almost immediately. She promised to back me up if necessary. That felt like the first real ally I had outside myself. Then came the work on the bigger picture. I had always been focused on just surviving, just fixing the financial chaos Mom had caused. But now, I was thinking strategically. Mom and Ashley had always relied on my silence and compliance. They had counted on me swallowing my pride and guilt-tripping myself for their sake. I realized that the best revenge wouldn't be impulsive or vindictive. It would be methodical, public if necessary, and undeniable. I started mapping out their patterns. Mom's manipulations were subtle, but consistent. She favored Ashley, twisted situations to her advantage, and relied on emotional leverage to keep everyone in line. Ashley, for her part, had never taken responsibility for anything, but had a knack for playing innocent, keeping people off balance. Together, they were a small, formidable team, but only if I let them control the narrative. I made a list of every time they had taken advantage of me, from childhood to the recent financial disaster. I included dates, witnesses, and outcomes. The more I documented, the more empowered I felt. At the same time, I refined my own persona. I started posting more confidently on social media, highlighting professional achievements, subtle displays of independence, and moments where I had overcome adversity. Nothing overt, nothing boastful, just a quiet demonstration that I was thriving despite everything. I knew Mom and Ashley followed me online. I wanted them to see that I wasn't broken, that their efforts to manipulate me had failed. One evening, I received a text from Ashley. "Tyler, Mom says she wants to meet. Can we talk tomorrow?" My first instinct was to ignore it, but I realized ignoring them completely wouldn't give me control of the situation. I needed to engage on my terms. I replied, carefully, "I'm free tomorrow evening. Send the location." As soon as I sent it, I began planning. I scouted the location, a small cafe halfway between their house and mine. It was public, which was perfect. No one could physically intimidate me, and there would be witnesses if things got heated. I also considered legal precautions, quietly consulting a friend who was a lawyer about the best ways to protect myself during the meeting without revealing too much. I wasn't ready to confront them fully yet. This was the setup, the first step toward exposing their actions strategically. Meanwhile, I kept working on my business. I upgraded my website, increased my marketing, and even started drafting a small expansion plan that would put me on a bigger financial and social footing. I wanted to enter the meeting confident, not just emotionally but materially. They couldn't intimidate someone who had tangible power and security. I also started keeping a mental record of their psychological tendencies. Mom would try to guilt me, to make me question my own memory and morality. Ashley would mirror Mom's tactics, always playing the innocent, vulnerable, or offended role. I began practicing responses in my head, calm, firm, and precise. I wouldn't rise to emotional bait. I would control the narrative, piece by piece, like a chess player maneuvering an opponent into checkmate. Then came the day I realized I had an unexpected advantage, their overconfidence. They assumed I was still the same passive, compliant son. They thought I would meet, be persuaded, and quietly continue to bear the consequences of their manipulations. That arrogance worked in my favor. I had spent months becoming a version of myself they couldn't predict. I had strength, strategy, and allies, all quietly positioned while they believed they were still in control. A few days before the meeting, I took additional precautions. I had copies of all the documents I needed, organized in a binder, ready to present if necessary. I prepared my phone to record the conversation discreetly, not for social media, but as undeniable proof if they denied anything later. I even rehearsed potential dialogues, imagining Mom attempting her emotional tactics and Ashley trying to deflect responsibility. Each rehearsal strengthened my confidence, making the scenario feel less like a confrontation and more like a calculated plan I was about to execute. During this time, I also found a small, quiet satisfaction in watching my own growth. I had rebuilt my finances, strengthened my business, and developed a strategy for facing the people who had hurt me most. The anger and hurt were still there, but they were no longer paralyzing. They were tools I could wield. I began to see them not just as threats or manipulators, but as pieces on a board that I could control. Then, the final piece fell into place: timing. I realized the perfect moment for the confrontation. Mom and Ashley had an event they were both attending, a family gathering that they expected me not to attend. It was the perfect opportunity, public enough that any manipulations could be scrutinized, yet private enough that I could have their attention without interference. I didn't reveal my attendance. I didn't warn them. Instead, I started planning my entrance, the evidence I would present, and the way I would orchestrate their realization that they were no longer in control. I also prepared a contingency. If the public confrontation went sideways, I had legal and financial recourse ready. Everything I had built over the last months, financial stability, business growth, documentation, witnesses, was now a safety net. They could try to twist reality, manipulate, or gaslight me, but I had the upper hand. By the night before the meeting, I felt a calm I hadn't known since discovering the fraudulent accounts. The fear and chaos of the past months had been replaced by quiet, resolute purpose. I knew what I had to do, and I knew that once I acted, there would be no turning back. I went to bed early, reviewing the plan in my head. Every interaction, every word, every move had been calculated to perfection. I wasn't acting out of impulse anymore. This was methodical, strategic. I had turned my suffering into power, and soon, Mom and Ashley would see the consequences of their actions. By the time the day of the family gathering arrived, I felt like I was wearing someone else's calm. It wasn't bravado or a mask. It was the steady product of months of work, of paying off fraudulent cards, of building a business that didn't just keep me afloat, but gave me real options. I'd rehearsed everything, yes, but more than lines and documents. I'd practiced holding myself steady when the people who'd taught me to doubt myself tried to make me small again. That steadiness was my real weapon. The gathering was at the same community center where our extended family did birthdays and charity potlucks. It was exactly the kind of place they felt comfortable, neutral, public, a place where your image mattered because everyone we knew might be there. Mom and Ashley arrived early, of course, perfectly coiffed, Mom clutching a purse that had once been a splurge I'd helped pick out as a birthday present when I was small and eager to please. They wore the look of people who expected sympathy and performance, fluttering eyes, soft hands, practiced sadness. I watched them from across the room, then glanced at the people I'd quietly lined up as part of my plan. My cousin Claire, who'd agreed to sit where she could corroborate moments. Two neighbors who'd witnessed weird behavior from Mom. My lawyer, who'd told me to be calm and collect, and a handful of clients and friends who knew my work and were there to be a quiet but tangible reminder that I had a life that didn't end at my family's whims. When I walked in, the room hummed with polite conversation. A few heads turned, some surprised to see me. Many of them had only seen my social media updates and likely expected me to be still shell-shocked and apologetic. I felt a small, almost absurd pleasure at that expectation. I took a seat at the long table, close enough to Mom that she would see me, far enough that she couldn't corner me. She caught my eye and gave a weak smile. Ashley looked at me like I'd interrupted her performance. There was irritation there. She didn't like being undercut. We pretended the first course of the potluck was normal. We pretended to discuss weather and old photos and the usual family trivia. Then I stood up, and the hum of the room anodized into a thin hush. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply said, "I'd like to say something." My voice was even. That evenness did more damage than anything dramatic could have. People leaned in because that's what you do. You listen to a son speak when the room smells like a reveal. I laid out the binder on the table like an exhibit. The first few pages were mundane, bank statements, debt collector notices. The next pages told the story the way the data always does. Dates, account numbers, signatures that didn't match mine, transference documents, the second mortgage paperwork with Mom's forged explanation, and a copy of the transfer of inheritance that had been signed without my knowledge. I handed the binder to Claire and asked her to pass it to Dad. She did, and his fingers trembled just a little as he flipped the pages. He had the look of a man who'd thought he knew his home and then found that someone had been shifting the floorboards overnight. I didn't say a word for a moment. I let the evidence breathe in the room. I let the murmurs begin. Mom's face went pale, and Ashley's jaw tightened so hard the vein in her temple stood out. I felt a cold wash of vindication when a few elderly relatives, people Mom had always leaned on, exchanged the same look I'd seen in every bank's customer service call, disbelief edged with betrayal. That look meant things were starting to fracture in ways she couldn't spin away. "Tyler," Mom said, voice small and pleading, "what is all this? You can't just—" She looked to the crowd as if an audience was supposed to give her lines. I opened my phone, clicked the file, and set a recording to play. It was the discreet recording I'd taken weeks earlier, the one where Mom explained to Ashley on a panicked voicemail how she'd used my name because we can't lose the house, and where Ashley's voice, sweet and practiced, replied, "Just tell him later. He'll understand." Hearing those words in the room, cold, unembellished, and human, was its own kind of proof. No lawyer speak, no forensic analysis required. They had said it. People listened. There were no dramatic gasps from the peanut gallery, just a settling quiet, the kind that happens when a group realizes a story they've been told as a comfort is now a lie. I watched the subtle shifts. Extended relatives who had always nodded at Mom's discomfort now looking at Ashley with a different light in their eyes. Claire reached out and placed her hand on my father's shoulder, a small but visible sign of alliance. That was the first part of my revenge. Public exposure with evidence so clear that no amount of charm or manipulation could erase it. But I didn't stop there. I needed the consequences to be formal and permanent. I wanted the restitution to be legal, not just social. I stood back and let the room gas out its small, shocked noises while my lawyer rose and explained, in calm, careful terms, what the documents showed: identity theft, fraud, misappropriation of inheritance funds, and forged documents. He said the words no one wants to hear from someone who has always been family. There will be a police report. There will be charges if the investigation finds intent. He didn't scream. He said it like a mechanic stating the part that's broken. That tone made people believe it more. Mom's hands flew to her mouth as if to stop the words from taking shape. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. "You don't understand. You understand enough to take advantage of your own son." Claire interjected, quietly but firmly. "We remember asking you about the mortgage 5 years ago. We remember you being unusually secretive about money." She didn't yell, she confirmed. That's what did the work. Confirmation from outside the immediate family is like light through a crack. It gets inside. Ashley tried the innocent routine. Tears, confusion, the old "I didn't know." But when I pointed to a specific deposit she'd made into her own account from the inheritance funds, that routine cracked. I had bank records cross-referenced with dates she'd been out shopping and receipts that matched purchases. I had texts where she'd asked Mom how to cover certain payments. People who had assumed she was the sheltered younger sister now saw a person who had actively benefited. The fallout was not instant theater, and that made it worse for them. There was no melodramatic screaming match that cleared everything in an hour. Instead, there were 1,000 tiny maneuvers. Relatives calling other relatives, neighbors recounting odd behaviors, the mechanics of how fraud works being explained in low, practical voices. My lawyer walked me through the process publicly. What would happen when I filed the police report, how the banks respond to forged documents, what restitution might look like, and most importantly, what I had to do to ensure this wasn't just a drama and then nothing. The room listened. People who had backed Mom in private conversations now sat on their hands. That silence was a slow, painful retribution. After the meeting, a few things happened very quickly. I filed the official complaints. I provided the banks with the affidavits and the disputed signatures. Because I'd documented everything meticulously, and because I'd already cleared the fraudulent balances myself to avoid ongoing collection damage to my credit, the banks moved faster than I'd expected. They reopened accounts, froze transfers, and initiated fraud investigations. The local detective assigned to my case called me within 48 hours, not to say we'll arrest someone tomorrow, but to confirm that enough evidence existed to pursue charges if the investigation matched the paper trail. The process would be slow and bureaucratic, and the legal truth isn't instantaneous. But when systems start moving against someone, their ability to hide dwindles fast. In the weeks that followed, the family fracture widened into an almost surgical separation. Some relatives refused to speak to Mom and Ashley. Others tried to mediate and were slapped with a quiet refusal from those who now saw the situation as moral clarity rather than family soap opera. Dad, my father, who had been silent and broken for months, sat across from me one evening and said, "I didn't want to believe it either. I thought she was protecting us. I thought I could fix it. But this is what we have to do." He was tired, but I saw in his face an honest grief for the part he'd played in staying silent too long. He told me he had signed back the portion of the inheritance he still controlled, legally undoing as much of Mom's transfers as possible, and he had begun cooperating with the investigation. That cooperation was as strong a rebuke as anything I could have scripted. Ashley's fallout was messy and inevitable. Her excuses, at first barely audible, became defensive, then legalistic. Her job, which relied on local goodwill and references from community members, evaporated when a manager I'd once helped install called in a favor to verify receipts and returns. Friends who'd taken her side now passed on events she was no longer welcome at. She tried to play victim, but the ledger of receipts, texts, and cited purchases argued a different case. There's something lightweight people don't consider. When your reputation is thin as tissue, a paper trail tears it easily. Mom, meanwhile, did what manipulators do when the audience thins. She retreated into self-justification. She sent letters, apologies that were really pleas for sympathy, explanations disguised as lectures. She begged for counseling with Dad, and then privately texted Ashley that I'd gone too far. The police talked to her. The banks froze certain assets. The community that had so often forgiven her for theatrical sadness began, in quieter ways, to withdraw its emotional credit. She'd always been skilled at getting forgiveness as a performance. This time, the performance met with the hard wall of documentation and law. Perhaps the most satisfying, unexpectedly gentle part of the revenge was the way the community rallied behind me. Not in a triumphant, gloating way, but with practical kindness. Clients recommended me at business meetings. Neighbors who had spoken up in my favor emailed the detective with small corroborations that, together, painted a fuller picture. Claire brought me casseroles when I was exhausted from dealing with banks and lawyers. Friends returned phone calls and listened. Little things, phone calls returned, meetings kept, shows of support, did more to heal me than any grand gesture of humiliation. Revenge felt less like cruelty and more like justice. As the investigations progressed, there were formal outcomes. Ashley was placed on administrative leave from her job, pending an internal audit that made it clear her purchases and the transfers into her account were not separable from the misappropriated funds. The bank revoked certain authorizations Mom had used and opened internal fraud cases. Mom was charged with identity theft and fraud. The initial arraignment was quiet. No cameras, no drama, but the indictment was real. The legal system moved at its own pace, but each step forward was a stone removed from a locked chest. The community's patience in watching this unfold was, in the end, part of the punishment. Public trust is a fragile currency, and they had spent it. What surprised me most wasn't the legal outcome. It was the quiet way my life continued to rebuild and the small moments of reclamation that felt truer than any headline. I expanded my consultancy, hired an assistant I trusted implicitly, and finally bought a small condo that felt like mine in a way my childhood home never had after everything that happened. Dad came to a few of my company's small gatherings, always humble, always careful with his words. He and I developed a slower, more honest relationship. We still had hard conversations. Forgiveness didn't arrive overnight. But there was now a baseline of truth where there had been too many shadows. Mom asked for space, then for reconciliation, then for mercy. I gave her a measured answer, not cold, not warm. I told her I'd support her being accountable. That was a sentence I hadn't known I had the right to say when I was younger. I didn't want to watch someone I loved suffer, but neither did I want to pretend nothing happened. I learned that accountability and cruelty are different things. I'd wanted justice, not vengeance for its own sake. The legal proceedings gave me that. Consequences based on evidence and procedure, not on raw emotion. There were nights when the weight of it all still hit me. Moments where the old quiet tensions pressed against my chest, and I wondered if the person I was before this would ever fully return. But most mornings, I woke up lighter. I had my business, friends who had stayed, finances that were mine, and a family tree pruned of the poisonous branches. I'd once been someone who swallowed my anger and told myself that keeping peace was the same as keeping love. I'd learned that peace achieved through silence is often just a slow kind of damage. On a clear afternoon several months after the gathering, Dad and I sat on a bench in the park, the place where he'd taught me how to ride a bike with trembling hands and a stubborn heart. He looked at me and smiled. Not the forced, appeasing smile he used to give when the world was slightly askew, but a steady, honest one. "You did right," he said simply. "Not because I asked you to, but because you had to." I nodded. There was no triumphant gloating in my chest, only a quiet sense of being rebuilt. The revenge had not been a fireworks show. It had been careful work, papers filed, relationships mended and severed thoughtfully, incisions made where rot had taken hold. The people who had tried to profit from my silence now had to account for their actions in a world with rules. The fallout was real and sometimes brutal for them. For me, it was a clearing. As we got up to leave the bench, Dad hesitated and then reached into his jacket. He handed me a small, worn envelope, the only thing left from my grandmother's paperwork that hadn't been tangled in the mess. Inside was a single, old letter she'd written me when I was small. The ink faded, but the words clear. "Stand for yourself. Truth is a horizon you walk toward." I folded the letter into my pocket and felt, for the first time in a long while, that I had done exactly that. When I walked away from the park, I didn't feel like a victor gloating over ruined reputations. I felt like someone who had finally taken his life back piece by piece. The finality wasn't in a shouted victory. It was in small certainties. My name cleared, my accounts safe, my work expanding, and the knowledge that I would never again allow my silence to be the currency others spent. The house with its sagging gutters would heal or crumble on its own terms. That was not mine to fix anymore. I had other things to build. And as the late afternoon light cut clean lines across the pavement, I realized that the last piece I needed wasn't revenge at all. It was permission to be proud, to be free, to set boundaries that no one could cross again. I reached into my pocket, smoothed the old letter, and let its words sit with me. I had wanted them to see the consequence of their choices, and they had. I had wanted my life back, and I did. I had wanted to stop being the son who swallowed everything to keep the peace, and now, finally, that son was gone. I walked on, feeling, for the first time in years, like every step was mine.